Does your employee network have a comms lead and an events lead? If so, then this video is for you, because I'm challenging, why does every ERG training program or blueprint tell you that you need to have one? And actually, are these roles preventing you from having a more strategic impact? So, hello, this is ERG Strategy, the channel that brings you training, tips, tools, techniques to help you build more engaged, effective employee resource groups that really do make a difference in your organisations and in the world at large. So if that's what you're here for, you're in the right place. What I'm going to cover in this video is what are those standard roles that you see in lots of different employee resource groups. You see in lots of articles and training videos and things like that, not mine. I'm also going to talk about when do comms and events leads make sense as permanent roles in your committee structure. I'm going to talk about maturity and why it stops to make sense to have particularly the events roles. I am also going to talk about then, so how do you resource the events roles, right? Who's going to actually do the work? And then I'm going to talk about just some case studies and different ways of actually resourcing what it is that you do as a network. So what are the standard roles that you see in most employee resource groups? Yeah, comms and events are really the two that I see 99% of the time, I would say, comms and events leads, right? But then I've also seen as well, especially, and the larger and the more complex the organisation, the more of this I see, a treasurer, a data lead, a head of partnerships as in like with external partners. So often it's like charities and CICs, etc. I sometimes see coaches, that they're a bit of an exception, but sometimes see that as a standard role within the committee. The one thing I would say in terms of these standard roles, and typically the larger the organisation and the more complex, the more fixed roles you have. I've even seen a chief of staff in an ERG. This was for, and the organisation shall remain nameless, but it was a global, very complex organisation, very, very, very large organisation. And also there's another organisation I can think of as well, which is actually Xerox, which if you know, you know, as in they had the first ERGs reportedly in the late 60s. And my understanding is that their ERGs are actually incorporated as kind of like separate legal entities. And so it probably makes sense that actually that they have to have some standard roles just because of the governance that's been put in place around those particular networks. So if you're in an organisation that has fairly strict governance like that, as in it's mandated because maybe it literally is a different legal entity or it reports into a legal entity that's maybe like a foundation or a charity or something within the organisation, then that's completely kettle of fish. I understand why you may have that, and this is a slightly different argument. This video is really around the effectiveness of having those roles and whether there's a better way to tackle it, right? So you've got all of these typical standard roles, and what it can sometimes lead to actually is bloat within committees. And I did a video about committee numbers. I mean, actually I was working with an organisation recently where for some of these roles they had like 2 and or 3 people in the same committee doing that role. And to me, I mean, that was just unnecessary. It was unnecessary. I think it was partly to sort of just justify having people on the committee, like rather than having difficult conversations and say, we don't need to have a committee that's this large. I think it was just giving people roles for the sake of it, if I'm being completely honest, right? And so, you don't want to get into that. But let's talk about the comms and events roles in particular and when they do actually make sense. So there's a link to my online maturity evaluation, online maturity scorecard that you can use to measure the maturity and or effectiveness of your organisation in terms of where you are, and you'll get some free reports or advice and guidance that you can put in place, right? Some free sort of tips and practical actions. So when you're at the start phase of your network, so if the network's only been going for like say a couple of years, you're still really in what we would consider to be like the community building phase, right? you're still building community. And so one of the best ways of actually building community is getting people together, whether that be online or, preferably in person. That's how you build community. That's how people build relationships. Yes, it can be done virtually, but it's not as effective as getting people together for an event, right? So I completely understand that in the first 2 to 3 years, even maybe, if you're doing lots of events, you want to have an events lead, because it's going to be probably the bread and butter of what you do. I mean, it doesn't have to be, if you want to start an ERG and you want to go straight into like some of the harder stuff, like changing policy and whatever it be. When I say changing, I obviously mean influencing, right? Influencing and suggesting and giving ideas, etc. Because ERGs don't write policy, right? Remember. But if you want to get straight into that stuff, absolutely fine. But the reality is that most networks don't. Most networks start with community build. Let's build community. Let's make people feel supported. Let's create a space where people can get information and advice, etc. And that's why the focus initially is on comms and events. And comms is so that people know. Comms is typically so that people know what events are happening. That's typically how comms are being used, and that's why I sort of like put them together, because lots and lots of events needs lots and lots of comms, right? They kind of go together like that. So I completely get why in the start you might have a comms and events lead. However, and this is something that a lot of networks come to me about. They're like, oh, we've been going for a few years and people have started to not come to events. Like engagement has started to drop off. And I'll tell you why. And, if I've worked with you or you've watched many of these videos, you'll know why. Because sadly, events don't often drive sustaining, lasting change that really makes a difference to people's experience of everyday work or their chances of progression or promotion. And so people get tired of it. They're like, well, we're just coming along to these events and yeah, they're okay, but nothing's really changing. And that's why engagement often starts to drop off. And even in the organisation, the colleagues and managers and senior leaders that are looking at the network start to question its purpose and whether it's effective if all the network is doing is events and there is no difference that's being made. So that's why after a few years of just doing events, networks need to be thinking of something different. And so once you're more mature, you want to be thinking about how can we make more of an impact? And that typically isn't coming through events, it's coming through other things. The only caveat I would make to this around events, and maybe you've heard me say this before, but there are some organisations that have big budgets, right? Mega budgets, to literally get celebrities in. And when I say celebrities, I literally do mean, the Stephen Bartletts of the world, the whoever, minor, major and or minor celebrities in. And sometimes just because of those events being so high profile, they do actually almost like create these momentums or potential tipping points in terms of changing attitude or maybe changing culture. But I'd still say that the impact can be short-lived, right? So, but that's just the one exception I want to make about events, right? So for organisations, for ERGs that are a little bit more mature, you want to be focusing to more strategic work that is more around delivering impact. And that probably means fewer events and freeing up capacity then to get involved in other things, whether that be a development program, a mentoring program or a sponsorship program, or influencing some area of policy, or getting involved in product and service delivery or product and service improvements. This is the kind of thing that you really want to be freeing up committee time to get involved with, because those are the things that actually are going to make a lasting impact. And so do you need an events lead, a permanent events lead for the whole year? If actually you're not going to be doing events all year, probably not. And that's why, my view is that you don't necessarily need a full-time events lead role if you're going to be doing different things. Now, the question you might ask is, well, maybe we're not going to do events every month or every quarter, but we're still going to do International Women's Day, or we're still going to do Black History Month, or we're still going to do Pride Month. So what do we do then if we've got no events lead? Well, here's the reality. There is still events resource within your organisation, probably sitting in your marketing team, marketing and or comms team, and those teams increasingly are getting involved in these flagship and hero events, because often they're actually externally facing as well. And so there's nothing wrong with you as an ERG. This helps actually when you've got your inclusion lead kind of like helping to manage this, helping to sort out this supportive resource. But the role, as I see it, should be the ERG working with those central teams. The central teams doing most of the delivery and the execution, and also coming up with ideas, but working with the ERG in terms of the ideas. And, do we think this will work, etc.? How do we want to do this? And then the ERG also supporting around the delivery and the execution, but it really being owned in terms of, if you were to sort of point to like one team that sort of like owns the delivery of the thing, for me that should be like your marketing and comms team should now own the delivery of those particular events, with the ERG supporting and giving ideas and almost like acting as like an internal consultant. To me, that is the ideal model, and it's also the more sustainable model as well. ERGs are never here to like do the day jobs of people that really should be doing the day jobs with an inclusive lens. ERGs are really kind of like just filling a gap and like almost like raising the awareness levels of the organization. But the model of delivery really is that people that are paid to do a day job, they incorporate inclusion into everything, and it's just that ERGs can help that to happen. But ERGs don't suddenly have to like take on every day job themselves and effectively give themselves, a second and or third job, right? So that's part of the reason that I'm a really big fan of the central team supporting these big hero and flagship events. And you maybe have a rule that's something like, every network gets one or maybe two hero events per year, so that it's kind of like manageable, right? And there are some rules that are put around the use of the resource, because neither do you want the comms team only doing inclusion and awareness events all year. And then let's talk about other ways of filling the roles, or what are the kinds of roles that you should have in your committee, and how do you go about it? So here's what I typically advise ERGs is, at the start of the year, when you've decided what your priorities are and your key activities and initiatives, then you decide what roles you need. And yes, absolutely, if you just happen to be delivering an initiative that as part of the change management, it needs a few events, for example, in different locations, and so it makes sense to have an events lead, right? But if you're doing a year where you're like, do you know what, we really need to focus on, for example, policy this year, because we're hearing a lot of noise from our community members that policies are not serving them, and that there is, for example, very inconsistent treatment. So you might be like, we're going to focus on these 2 or 3 policies over this year. Then you don't need an events lead. But actually what you might need, if you're looking at, say, 3 policies, you might need 3 different individuals that are going to do the work to find out what the issues are with the community, and then take it back to HR and or the policy owner to influence and see whether you can get those policies changed. So basically you've determined the role based on what the priorities are for the network. Now, I've been saying this for a while with organisations that I've been doing training with, but it's really interesting. I did a reference call a few weeks ago, and this is something I do. I've been using reference calls in my change management and transformation toolkit for a long time, but this is something I've been doing recently, is reference calls between 2 different organisations, ERGs, where one is maybe slightly further ahead than the other, so that they can learn from each other and share what's working. And what was really interesting, one of the organisations, It's a Monday morning and I'm so tired. I've started trying to record these on a Monday morning because I figure out it's the only way I can get it done. So it's the first thing on my diary. It's not even 8 o'clock yet in the morning. Right. So one of the organisations that I was on this reference call with, when we started talking about filling roles, so I talked about my approach of, ERGs looking at the start of the year, what's on, and then assigning roles. This organisation, this is a large global organisation, and they were saying they look by quarter. So obviously they've set the goals for the year, they've kind of set the priorities for the year, but then they look quarter by quarter at what's coming up. But then they also factor in the capacity of the committee members. And I love this. So the capacity in terms of, because somebody's day job might suddenly be busy, or somebody might have something going on in their personal life that means they have no longer got the capacity to do this thing in the next quarter. And so actually they then rejig the resources around to suit what it is that they need to achieve as a network, but also the capacity based on what's going on for committee members. And I absolutely love that. So that is a great model. To me, that this is the perfect way of deciding who needs to do what. The other way as well, I was talking with a co-chair a few years ago, I remember, and I was saying to her, how do you make sure that as a co-chair, you're not the one doing all of the work yourself? And she basically said, look, what I do is when a committee member or a community member comes with an idea that they want to drive with, I say to them, lead it then. Right? So, you make that person responsible for leading it. Yes, you support them and potentially give them more resources and a steer, etc. But you get them involved in the actual completion of the work. And I think that is a perfect way of making sure that everybody is involved. And again, it's not just having these standard roles that are there for the sake of it, that may or may not align with the priorities that you need to deliver as a network. And that's it. That's it for this morning. First thing on a Monday morning. Gosh, it's early, but if this is the only way I can do it, this is what we're going to do. So that was it. If you thought this was useful, please do share it with your co-chair, with your committee. Maybe share it with your comms and events lead. Maybe see whether they want to see if there's something else that they could be doing that will be more productive, rather than banging their head against a wall, creating events for people that aren't turning up. So please do give us this a thumbs up if it was useful. Share it around, subscribe, etc. All of the things. And I will see you on Friday for my LinkedIn Live, 8:30 UK time. Ciao.